On the morning of April 1st, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat on the deck of the USS Hornet, their wings nearly touching the edges of the aircraft carrier's flight deck. The 80 young airmen who would crew these aircraft thought they were participating in a training exercise, possibly bound for Hawaii or Australia. They had no idea they were about to embark on one of the most daring missions in military history. A mission so secret that even they, the men who would risk their lives to execute it, were kept in the dark about their true destination until the very last moment. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, the man who conceived and would lead this impossible mission, understood that secrecy was their only advantage. The plan was simple in concept, but staggering in its audacity. Launch a squadron of Army Air Force bombers from an aircraft carrier, something that had never been attempted before, fly them 1,500 miles across the Pacific Ocean, bomb the Japanese mainland, then somehow make it to friendly airfields in China before running out of fuel. The margin for error was essentially zero, and success depended on maintaining absolute secrecy until the moment of execution. The seeds of this mission had been planted just 4 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft had devastated Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 Americans and crippling the Pacific Fleet. President Roosevelt had immediately demanded retaliation against the Japanese homeland, but the military reality seemed impossible. Japan was protected by thousands of miles of ocean and a formidable naval force. American aircraft carriers were too valuable to risk in Japanese waters, and no existing bomber had the range to reach Japan from secure Allied bases. Doolittle, a 55-year-old pilot who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, had approached the problem with characteristic methodical precision. He calculated that B-25 Mitchell bombers, if stripped of unnecessary weight and loaded with extra fuel tanks, might just have enough range to reach Japan from a carrier-launched position. The catch was that no B-25 had ever taken off from a carrier deck, and the physics of the situation suggested it might be impossible. The bombers would need to accelerate from zero to takeoff speed in just 467 feet. Less than half the distance typically required. The pilots selected for this mission were volunteers, though they didn't know what they were volunteering for. They had been told only that they would be participating in a dangerous and important mission that would require them to risk their lives for their country. The men who stepped forward came from every corner of America: farm boys from the Midwest, college graduates from the East Coast, mechanics' sons from industrial cities. What united them wasn't their background, but their willingness to trust their lives to a mission they couldn't understand. Training began in February 1942 at Eglin Field in Florida, where the crews practiced taking off in impossibly short distances. Day after day, they pushed their bombers to the limits of physics, learning to coax maximum performance from engines and airframes stressed beyond their design parameters. They practiced navigation over water, formation flying at extreme range, and fuel conservation techniques that would mean the difference between completing their mission and dying in the Pacific. Still, they had no idea where they were going or why these particular skills would be needed. The psychological pressure on these men was immense, though they couldn't articulate why. They were training for something unprecedented, something that their instructors couldn't fully explain because the instructors themselves weren't cleared to know the complete plan. The pilots began to suspect they were preparing for a suicide mission, but the Code of Military Service in 1942 America meant that such thoughts were never voiced aloud. They trained with the dedication of men who had already accepted death as a likely outcome. Security around the mission was so tight that even senior Navy officials were kept in the dark about specific details. The bombers were loaded onto the Hornet under cover of darkness, with crews told they were being transported to their actual departure point. It wasn't until the carrier had cleared San Francisco Bay and was heading west into the Pacific that the pilots began to understand the magnitude of what they were attempting. Even then, they were told only that they would be bombing somewhere in the Pacific. The specific target remained classified. The human drama aboard the Hornet during those weeks at sea was extraordinary. 80 young men, most barely out of their teens, faced the prospect of flying an untested mission into the unknown while maintaining the facade of routine military operations. They wrote letters home that they couldn't send, made personal preparations for death that they couldn't discuss, and supported each other through fear and uncertainty that military training had never prepared them to handle. The psychological toll was evident in their faces, their conversations, and their increasing focus on mechanical details that might make the difference between success and failure. Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, carried his own burden of secrecy. He knew that his ship was taking 80 American airmen to what might be their deaths, and that the success or failure of their mission could determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The weight of that knowledge was visible to his crew, who began to understand that whatever was happening on their ship was more important than any mission they had previously undertaken. The breaking point came on April 18th, when Japanese patrol boats spotted the American task force 650 miles from Japan, 200 miles farther than planned. Doolittle faced an impossible choice: abort the mission and return home with nothing accomplished, or launch immediately despite being beyond the calculated range for safe completion. The decision he made in that moment would define not just the success of the mission, but the character of American military leadership for the remainder of the war. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's bomber lifted off from the Hornet's deck with just feet to spare. One by one, the remaining 15 aircraft followed, each takeoff a death-defying demonstration of pilot skill and mechanical precision. As they formed up and headed west toward Japan, the men finally understood what they had been training for. They were about to bomb the Japanese homeland, something that military experts had declared impossible. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. The flight to Japan tested every skill these pilots had developed during their intensive training. They flew at wave-top level to avoid detection, navigating by dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The psychological pressure was enormous. They were flying toward a target they had never seen, in aircraft operating at the absolute limits of their capabilities, with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. The only thing that sustained them was their faith in Doolittle's leadership and their commitment to avenging Pearl Harbor. When the bombers reached Japan at midday on April 18th, they found a nation completely unprepared for attack. Air raid sirens had never sounded in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, or Kobe because Japanese military leaders had convinced themselves that the homeland was invulnerable to American assault. The psychological impact of the bombing was far greater than the physical damage. For the first time since the war began, ordinary Japanese citizens saw American aircraft over their cities, dropping bombs on targets that included the imperial capital itself. The aftermath of the bombing was even more harrowing than the mission itself. With insufficient fuel to reach their intended landing fields in China, the 16 bombers scattered across the Chinese countryside. Some crews crash-landed in fields, others bailed out over mountains, and a few made emergency landings on beaches. 3 men died in crashes, 8 were captured by Japanese forces and subjected to brutal interrogation and torture, and the remaining 69 faced a desperate struggle to reach safety through Japanese-occupied territory. Doolittle himself, convinced that the mission had been a failure because all 16 bombers had been lost, was preparing to face court-martial when he was rescued by Chinese forces. He couldn't have known that the raid's impact on Japanese strategy would be far more significant than its immediate military results. Emperor Hirohito and his military leaders, shaken by the realization that American bombers could reach their homeland, made the fateful decision to expand their defensive perimeter, leading directly to the disastrous Battle of Midway 6 weeks later. The captured airmen faced horrors that the American public wouldn't learn about for years. 3 were executed as war criminals, while the others endured torture, starvation, and psychological abuse designed to break their will and extract military information. Their stoic resistance to interrogation, maintained despite treatment that violated every principle of international law, demonstrated the character of the men who had volunteered for an impossible mission without knowing what they were volunteering for. When the full story of the Doolittle Raid finally emerged after the war, it revealed profound truths about American character and military innovation. The mission succeeded not because of superior technology or overwhelming force, but because 80 young men were willing to trust their lives to a leader who asked them to attempt the impossible. Their willingness to fly into the unknown, literally and figuratively, represented something essential about American military culture: the belief that with sufficient courage and ingenuity, any objective could be achieved. The psychological impact of the raid extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor and a string of defeats in the Pacific, the news that American bombers had struck Tokyo provided desperately needed proof that Japan was not invincible. For the Japanese, the raid shattered the illusion of homeland security and forced strategic decisions that would ultimately contribute to their defeat. The mission that began with such secrecy that even the pilots didn't know their destination became a turning point in the Pacific War. Today, only one Doolittle raider remains alive. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot on that historic mission, carries the memories of 80 men who volunteered for a mission they couldn't understand, flew into uncertainty with absolute determination, and proved that sometimes the most important military operations are those that seem impossible until someone finds the courage to attempt them. Their legacy lives on as a reminder that in the most desperate circumstances, American ingenuity and individual courage can achieve what conventional wisdom declares impossible.